Hello, welcome to Clarifying the Teachings. I'm pre-recording this one because next Sunday, which is when I'm supposed to teach Clarifying the Teachings again, we'll have a guest at our house. And the family has all kinds of plans. And it's possible that I would be back home and available to teach Clarifying the Teachings, but it's also possible that I wouldn't be. So I felt like the safest thing to do was go ahead and just pre-record it and provide that recording to Sina so that she can play it during my Clarifying the Teachings time. I had promised someone that once we finished the code, we would look at how to tell the difference between the ego and clarity, or sometimes I call that inner wisdom, or A Course in Miracles refers to that as the Holy Spirit or the right mind. So that's what I'm going to do in this hour. It is possible that you'll want to take some notes, so feel free to do so. Last week, I joked that if somebody held a gun to us and had us take a test on knowing the way of being that was not helpful and the way of being that was helpful, that we would all be able to pass that test because we do have that knowing. Well, this week is the cliff notes to that test. So again, you may want to take some notes, and if so, that's okay. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with the wrong mind or the ego. This is the common human mind, or the most familiar mind. So it's the way of being that is happening the most in the world now. One thing I want to say about this egoic way of being before I start talking about it is, seeing this in yourself does not mean that you're guilty. In fact, judging yourself as guilty is just another egoic way of being. Seeing this in yourself means that it's time to shift into another way of being, into the clarity, right? So first I'll talk about the egoic ways of being, and then we'll look at some of the clear ways of being that you can shift into. But that's all this is. It's about shifting from the ways of being that are not helpful into the ways of being that are helpful. It's not about judging ourselves for finding ourselves in the unhelpful ways of being. I hope that's clear. So let me just start. I just created a brainstorm list. So I can't promise that it's all inclusive, but I think it's pretty good. So let's start by looking at some of these egoic ways of being. So the first thing that I have on the brainstorm list was pretty obvious. It's judgment. The ego is a judging machine. And judgment can be, deciding what's, quote, good or bad, what's favorable or unfavorable, desired, undesired, what should happen, what should not happen, but can also be just making a decision. For example, deciding he's a jerk, she's really sweet, I don't know, it's hard for me to think of other decisions, but this political opinion is right. That's what the country should do or should not do. This shouldn't be happening. This should be happening. All of these decisions. So NTI says that judgment is the tool of illusion. An illusion is more than one thing. Illusion is duality. So judgment is the way of thinking that cuts things up into separate pieces instead of allowing them all to be one. So strictly speaking, saying this is a book, this is a cup, this is a remote control, this is a person, that is judgment. But that kind of judgment can be practical. It's good to know the difference between a remote control and a cup, for example, because the body needs water. It's good to know that. And so I want to drink water, and I don't want to put this under the faucet and run the water on this. I want to put this under the faucet and run the water on this. I don't want to attempt to drink out of this. I want to drink out of this. So judgment by itself, believe it or not, is not fully harmful. Some judgment is genuinely practical. But we have to discern, and by the way, discernment is just another type of judgment. We have to discern between what is genuinely practical and what isn't. For example, I'll hear judgments like this. Well, you know, I just have to know the difference between people that I can be with that, you know, bring me up, and people I can't be with that bring me down. That's how I take care of myself. That appears practical, but it isn't. Right? That's the type of judgment that is maintaining separation of these good people and these bad people. So one of the things we need to do is we need to learn the difference between judgment that is harmful and judgment that is practical. And I don't know how to tell you how to do that. I can tell you how I did it. I did it by wanting to awaken, wanting to know the true self, wanting to be only love. That aspiration was very helpful. By being truly committed to my aspiration, some kind of an inner discernment kicked in. It's this wisdom that's already here, this clarity that actually lives in us. This discernment clicked in, which helped me to see the difference between the judgment that isn't helpful and the judgment that is practical. So the judgment that creates the illusion, reinforces the separation, reinforces duality. That's the ego. In fact, perceiving separation is the ego. If you're writing this down, that would be the second thing to write down, perceiving separation. Last week I said I feel a kinship with grass and leaves. And that's a true statement. There's this intuitive sense of sameness. You know, words that popped through my mind before I came to the word sameness were like intuitive sense of connection, but it's actually more than connection. It's being the same fiber, the same essence, regardless of the appearance of difference. But ego focuses on the appearance of difference and sees that as the reality. So to an ego, a person might be much more valuable than grass or a leaf. There's no sameness there. And in fact, some people, maybe people with white skin are more important than people with another color skin, or maybe people in the American culture are more important than people of another nationality. Or maybe people that think spiritually in a certain way are more important than people who think in a religious way. That's ego. There isn't sameness, it sees difference. And ego also cares a lot about me, right? This one. And an important aspect of me, or this one, is what I call self-will. Self-will, of course, is what I want, the way I want things. And ego is very attached to that self-will. In traffic, ego wants to get where it's going. And red lights are in my way, other drivers are in my way, everything's in my way, because what matters to me is where I'm going, where I'm going. That's self-will. And with that in mind, we could say that ego is selfish or self-centered. It cares more about me than anyone else. And there are people that you could call extensions of me. My family is an extension of me. And in that case, I care more about my family than others. My country can be an extension of me. And then I care more about my country than others, put America first. Who knows if there was ever such a thing as an alien attack, my planet could become an extension of me, and the other planets and those people, those aliens, whatever they are, would be less than. So there's self-centeredness, which can be expanded to a like-minded group, or a group that somehow I feel connected to. Now, the ego also can appear generous, but the ego's habit is giving to get. I give to my children because I want them to be successful. Because when they're happy and they're successful, I don't have to worry. And maybe I look good to others, right? Ultimately, somehow it kicks back to I. I know someone who gave recently to a building that was being built, and they said, everyone who gives to this building, there'll be like a little monument to them. And this person's like, I want to go by there and see if they actually put the monument there. Giving to get. And of course, the ego has desires. These desires are a part of the self-will. But the interesting thing about the ego's desires is, as soon as one desire is satisfied, another desire is born. It's the endless seeking of the ego. That's because the ego thinks that getting is being. Right? So it gives to get, it desires to get, it needs to get. Getting is being. But that's only true if I'm getting things that I want, that satisfy my self-will. I want to avoid getting things I don't want. For example, I want to avoid conflict. Maybe. I want to avoid money problems. I want to avoid poor health. Right? I mean, the list could go on and on and on. So if it's something that the self-will wants, then I want to get it. And that's how I feel like a being as an ego. But if it's something that the self-will doesn't want, then I want to avoid it. So getting and avoiding are really like two sides of the same coin. What getting and avoiding aren't, they aren't just being with whatever arises. They're both like types of manipulation, maybe even attempts at control. So manipulation and control are part of the ego. The ego frequently thinks things should be different than they are. And this goes on and on and on. It's amazing how prolific the ego is at thinking things should be different than they are. It's too hot, too cold, too windy, not enough breeze, too much traffic, whatever. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. So the ego frequently wants things to be different than they are. Also, confusion is a part of the ego. The ego doesn't have clarity. It doesn't know. And so it thinks about things. And in that thinking about things, confusion often happens. Because what is best for this self-will? You know, like, is it best that I get that? Is it best that I avoid that and get this? You know, how do I figure all of this out so that I can keep this self-will perfectly happy, perfectly safe, perfectly loved all of the time? Trying to keep this self-will perfectly protected results in confusion. So confusion is a part of the ego mechanism. And that need to figure out that I just described, right? Needing to figure everything out to keep this self-will happy and safe and okay. Again, you can't just let things be. Because of the self-will and because of judgment, dividing things up into good and bad and wanted and not wanted, there's so much that has to be figured out and manipulated and controlled and managed. Just being with is not possible for the ego. In fact, the ego is certain that if it just bees with, it will be unhappy or in some way screwed, right? And of course, whenever you're trying to figure all this out, one thing you'll notice again are these conflicting thoughts. So conflicting thoughts are part of the ego. You know, like you'll think through this process and you'll think, okay, so this idea is probably what I really want. But then, oh, if I do that, then maybe this will happen. Then you're figuring out again, well, maybe this is the way I should go, you know, and these two conflict. Another thing that's part of the ego, which again is not just being, a lot of thoughts about the past and a lot of thoughts about the future. Instead of just being here on this bed with this breeze, with the sounds of these birds, There's worrying about the future, fretting about the past, trying to figure things out. Very mental. The ego is very mental. And there's lots of stories. In fact, it's fun to watch people get together and immediately start telling their stories. Oh, I was in the military for 10 years, and I had this sergeant that, blah, 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 and it's always about the stories. Who are we without our stories? Of course, the ego has a lot of fear, again, because it's trying to protect this self-will. And the self-will of those that are extensions of me, the family, etc. So there's a lot of fear, anxiety, worry, stress. And there's guilt, I'm guilty and others are guilty. The perception of guilt. Like I said, one of the mistakes that people might make after we go through this list of what the ego is feeling guilty when they catch themselves in the egoic way of being. They may feel guilty. And as I mentioned, that's just more ego. It isn't about feeling guilty. It's about shifting to an appropriate right-minded way of being or clear way of being that fits for this moment. That's the same as paying attention to this present moment and feeling your next highest vibration from the code and choosing that. It's that shift. These are just different words that are talking about the same thing. So it's not about judging ourselves or catching ourselves in an egoic way of being. In fact, it's really good to be grateful that we caught ourselves in an egoic way of being so that we can shift. But the ego will judge us for being in the ego. Isn't that funny? The ego will judge us for being in the ego and find us guilty. But the perception of guilt itself is the ego. Also, just being unworthy or not good enough. Some people sometimes describe it as shame or feeling inherently flawed. I'm not as good as others, right? I'm less than. That's all ego. And on the flip side of that, better than. You're less than, I'm better than. That is ego. And another side effect of that is being critical, either being critical of myself or being critical of others, or of course, both. So being critical of self and others is a part of the ego. And of course, the flip side of that is arrogance. And a really common type of arrogance is I'm right. What I think is right. My political opinion is right. My memory is right. My ideas about how things should be are right. That's arrogance. That's ego. And another aspect of the whole guilt thing is blaming other people. Especially blaming people for my experience. Like blaming my husband for my inability to feel free. Blaming the politicians for my inability to feel confident and safe. Accusing others of things. This is all ego. An attack, it doesn't even need to be a physical attack. Certainly physical attack is ego, but attacking people in my thought, attacking people in my gossip. And again, it doesn't even matter if I'm attacking others or myself, it's still ego. any type of attack. Aggression, which is more physical attack, any type of aggression, but it doesn't have to be physical attack. Yelling at people can be very aggressive, right? Any type of aggression. And the flip side of that, self-sabotage. I know people who every time they seem to get going in a positive way, they self-sabotage in some way. Another egoic characteristic is defense, wanting to defend myself. As I'm driving late to work, I'm thinking up the story I'm going to tell so I won't look bad for being late, right? Making excuses, anything defending me. And I'm not necessarily talking about, physical defense. There may be times, hopefully rarely, when someone is physically attacked, and physical defense may be the natural and right thing to do. I'm talking more about right now psychological defense. And I will say that when you're high enough in vibration, physical defense may fall away too. But I wouldn't force that. If physical defense is natural, then just trust that. That's what's right for you at the time, physical defense. But again, emotional defense, psychological defense, these are things that we can all let go of if we recognize that they're purely ego and that they're protecting the ego. They're protecting the idea of me. They're protecting the self-will. As well as defense mechanisms, right? You can go look up a list of defense mechanisms on the internet, or you can take Awakening Together's Keys to the Kingdom retreat. It's called Keys to the Kingdom, Freedom from the Ego. We go over defense mechanisms in that retreat. And look at these defense mechanisms and notice which ones do I use, because we each use different defense mechanisms, or maybe we use them all, but we use some more proficiently than others. All these defense mechanisms are part of the ego. Regret, regretting what I said. That's funny because, since I have come to a higher vibration, I still sometimes say things that are pretty stupid. But what has changed, and this is amazing, is that I don't regret what I say. I go, look what was just said. And then I'm able to just let it go immediately as part of the past. It's funny how stupid things can still come out of the mouth. Things that may have hit another person in a way that wasn't intended. But there's no regret. Regret is of the ego. There's insight, there's seeing, there's awareness, acceptance, letting go, but not regret. Grievances are of the ego. This, of course, is when, harboring ill feelings for someone because of something they said or did. So if something stupid did come out of my mouth, and then you harbored that against me, that's a grievance. That's of the ego. Just as I can let it go, you can let it go, right? Everybody can let it go. Letting it go, it's over, it's the past, it's a different universe, right? The boom, 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 boom universe, that universe is over. We can all let it go. But harboring regret for our own mistakes or grievance towards someone else, this is all of the ego. It's dragging that stuff from one universe to another. Frustration, being frustrated with things as they are, being frustrated for myself for not being able to do something. Right? All frustration is of the ego. Of course, hatred. anger, all anger. There is no justified anger. All anger is of the ego. Annoyance, irritation, annoyed with the sounds outside, or I'm irritated by how this person keeps doing that. That's all ego. Jealousy and envy are egoic. Even being jealous of my husband having an affair with a woman and being jealous of that woman, it's still egoic. Simply having expectations of others, believe it or not, is egoic. Having the expectation that my husband would be faithful is egoic. Now, the funny thing is if I happen to be married to someone that isn't faithful, clarity can accept that this is just the way this being is right now, and either stay or leave, whatever one feels called to do, without grievance, without jealousy, without anger, without attack. Because all those things are all egoic. Being aware and knowing what to do is clarity. So again, having expectations of others. Doesn't matter who those others are. Doesn't matter what the expectation is. Also, a general sense of lack. Doesn't matter what that general sense of lack is about. It could be that I'm not good enough. It could be that I don't have enough money. Any sense of lack, anything that a sense of lack is really seeing something as not perfect as it is, right? So whenever it's not perfect as it is, that's a sense of lack. And all sense of lack comes from the ego. Also, the problem-seeking mind comes from that sense of lack. I mean, people don't know it, but the mind seeks problems. Like the mind can walk into a place and say, oh, this needs to be fixed, and this needs to be fixed, and this needs to be fixed. And, certainly maybe something does need to be fixed. And if so, then there's just this knowing, oh, this really does need to be fixed. But when is the mind seeking out problems with things that are actually okay right now? They're fine as they are, right? Because that comes from that sense of lack, that problem-seeking mind, always looking for problems, always thinking about and figuring out solutions. That's actually coming from the sense of lack. Things aren't perfect as they are, right? Now, if the door won't close anymore, that's perfect. And it's perfect to recognize that the door needs to be replaced. This is back to the difference between what's practical and what's just purely egoic. And finding that clarity within to know the difference, that discernment. Suffering is actually egoic. Any type of suffering, from mild to severe. All suffering comes from a non-acceptance of what is. The ideas of victim and victimizer, emotional highs and emotional lows, those are ego. Clarity is much more even Steven, happy even Steven, content even Steven, right? But emotional highs, emotional lows, that's ego. Feeling somehow trapped, not free, burdened, that's ego. Being reactive to others and to situations, that's ego. So again, it's not an all-inclusive list. It's just a brainstorm of ways of being that are egoic. And so now what I want to do is I want to share the ways of being that come from clarity. These are the types of ways of being that you want to shift into. One of the earliest ways of being that I became aware of that was extremely helpful was just the desire to heal, the desire to awaken, the desire to know truth, genuine spiritual aspiration, we could call it. You know, like when I was completely living those egoic ways of being, that's just the way I was. That's the vibrational level I was at. I had this desire to heal. That's what I called it then, to heal the mind, desire to heal the conditioning, we could say, which is really a desire to learn how to abide as the helpful ways of being instead of these unhelpful ways of being. That desire for that shift is from the clarity side, from the helpful side. So having the desire to rise in vibration, however you want to word it. Non-judgmental awareness is a clear way of being. And what's interesting with non-judgmental awareness, at some point it becomes pure, where it's just pure non-judgmental awareness with everything. But the way I first started experiencing non-judgmental awareness was being able to see myself in the egoic way of being without judging myself for being there. So I might be reactive to someone, which is an egoic way of being, and then be able to see that I was reactive to someone, be able to take a deep breath and feel for what am I to do now, you know, rest, accept, and trust, whatever it is, and go through that entire process without judging myself. That's non-judgmental awareness. So whenever you're able to see without judgment, whatever you're seeing, right? Whenever you're able to see without judgment, that's non-judgmental awareness. That's a helpful way of being, or that comes from clarity. Also, where ego is always trying to figure things out, ego is always trying to manipulate, control, get things for the self-will or avoid things because the self-will doesn't want it. Clarity is much more spontaneous. So speaking happens, doing happens, but it doesn't have this root cause behind it of trying to get or avoid for the self-will. Doesn't have all this thinking and figuring out and judging and making decisions behind it. It's just happening. It's much more spontaneous. It's really being moved by the code, but by the higher vibrational levels of the code. So I think I talked about it last week as just knowing when you know, right? That's the spontaneity. Not trying to figure out what you should know, just knowing when you know and being able to wait or not know until you do. That's clarity. And one reason you can do that is because of another characteristic of clarity is there's this feeling that all is well. You don't have to know how it's all well. You don't have to figure out how to make sure it's well. There's just this feeling that all is well. And before that feeling of all is well comes, another aspect of clarity is trust. It's not trusting something specific, although it could start out that way, but it's more of an unconditional trust. It's this trust that all will be well. It kind of has a future aspect to it. Trust that all will be well. Trust that everything will work out. And then eventually that comes down to it. It takes the future aspect out of it, and it comes down to this current knowing that all is well. Right? The trust is more future based, and the all is well is more just current being. And where the ego, of course, perceives guilt and it blames people for things, may even blame the self for things, of course. Clarity perceives innocence. Innocence really being an aspect of the all is wellness. Very hard to describe in some situations where guilt appears to be apparent. But I think that Jesus responded to this best from the cross when he said, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." Right? Everybody's just believing the thoughts that the code brings into the mind, and they're just acting on those thoughts, no matter what they are. So there's even innocence in that because they don't know any better at this point. So perceiving innocence. And as I already talked about, the sameness, perceiving sameness, not only among humans, but among all things. All things are that same essence. And having a genuine perception of that. You know, it seems like this way of seeing, it feels like to me anyway, that this way of seeing comes from the heart, not from the mind. It's not a mental way of seeing. It's a heart-driven way of seeing. It's like the heart just knows that all things are the same. And so perceiving through the heart instead of perceiving through thought gives us the perception of sameness. And that's also what is called unity, and sometimes it's called connection. But unity consciousness is knowing all things are the same. That's unity consciousness. And of course, knowing I'm one with that, right? Yeah. The clarity is selfless because it doesn't have self-will. It's not that you don't see the personality's preferences. It's just that this person is not more important than that person. So if that person's preferences are known, those preferences are just as important as these preferences. And that's the natural way of seeing. Those preferences are just as important as these preferences. And not only that, there might be this knowing that, you know, I don't need my preferences. This person appears to need their preferences. So let's go with that, right? It's selflessness. We're not selfish, selfless. And giving can come out of that without wanting to get anything from that giving. And there's no sense of lack in the giving either. There's no worry that if I give, I won't have enough. Because that's self-centered, right? That self-centeredness isn't in that. In fact, there's this knowing that if I give, I will always have what I actually need. You could say if I don't have it, I must not need it. Also, there's awareness of the present as always present. Awareness of the present is always present. There's a huge awareness that the future is imagined and the past is at best remembered and often distorted in the memory. So not even remembered, also imagined. But the present is always present. You can just see the non-endingness of the present. So that awareness of the present is always present. And beyond that, there's even this awareness that I am the present. There's no separation between this present and this presence. They're the same. The same with the sense of here. And somehow the sense of perfection is tied up into that, which I can't explain. So like I can look across the room and I can see a chest of drawers that's falling apart, and I can know that, one day we'll probably replace that chest of drawers. And yet there's no sense of lack. There's no sense of that should be different than it is right now. It's perfect. And this sense of perfection, which is probably the all is well that I already talked about, is somehow related to this eternal now. And I can't explain that. But there's a fineness, all is fine. There's a fineness in now. Kind of reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who had recently been divorced, I think, and had recently left her job and didn't know where she was going to live, didn't know how she was going to get money, didn't know anything. And she was visiting her sister, and she was really afraid, and she was in that figuring out mode and that maybe regret and worry about the future and, just confusion and fear, all very egoic ways of being. And her sister came home from work one day and found her sitting in the sofa, all caught up in all of this. And her sister said, but you're just sitting on the sofa right now. Her sister saying, it's fine, right? You're just sitting on the sofa right now. Somehow in this eternal nowness, there's also this fineness. It's fine. Right? There's this perfection. Can't explain it. It's just a characteristic of it. It's just a part of it. So that's clarity. Also, the introspection itself, when we're all caught up in the egoic ways of being, which is where we all begin, and we start looking within and we start maybe practicing inquiry, we start wondering what our conditioning is, we start wondering, why am I afraid? We start looking this way and examining this way. That comes from clarity. Whenever we're out this way, a blame, attack, that shouldn't be, whatever, that's ego. But when our attention starts to turn this way, that's clarity. Another interesting aspect of clarity is compassion. Even though there's a knowingness that everything is fine, there's also a knowingness that not everybody sees it that way. That they're caught up in the ego way of being, and as a result, they are suffering. And there's a feeling of compassion for that. Compassion is different than seeing a problem. When you see a problem, you think it has to be fixed. I need to teach them not to see the way they see so they can be happy like me. That would be ego. Compassion still allows it to be as it is. Compassion still knows that it's perfect. It still has the all is well in it. But it also just knows that that they are suffering. I mean, again, some of the stuff I can't describe. Why would there be compassion if you know it's perfect? But there's just compassion that they're suffering, but still allowing, for it to be as it is, not needing to fix it or change it. Equanimity. It's for me a big word, but remember I talked about the emotional highs and the emotional lows, our ego. Equanimity is that consistent contentment, consistent acceptance, that consistent way of being. Like I'll say, I'm just as happy now on the top of a mountain as I am cleaning the toilet, and that's the truth. That consistency used to being on top of the mountain was the emotional high for me. That was like the best thing in the whole wide world. And cleaning the toilet, chore, right? Not the best thing in the whole wide world. I'd rather toilets clean themselves, and I suppose that's still a part of that. All is well, everything's perfect nowness, right? Because if everything is perfect, if all is well, then I'm just happy, no matter what appears. So this contentment, this peace, this okayness. Some people call that love. I remember, I don't know when it was a few years ago when it occurred to me. I used to think I was happy as one thing and love is another thing. And somehow they merged and I realized happiness is love. So it's the same thing. They're not separate. Happiness is love. Love is happiness. And I think that's what's meant by bliss. So bliss isn't some ecstatic high. Bliss is this even contentment, this happiness, this all is wellness. Also, I talked about spontaneity until there's the perfection of automation of the spontaneity. There's intuition. Intuition seems to be a bridge to the perfection of the automation of spontaneity. So intuition is the bridge of there still appears to be a thinker or a knower here, but I'm learning not to depend on the thinking. Instead, I ask the knowing and I receive an answer. That's a bridge to the perfect automation of spontaneity. But that bridge is still clarity. It's not ego. So intuition is clarity. And likewise, being surrendered to that intuition instead of going to the thinking, being surrendered to not knowing yet instead of trying to figure out, being surrendered to what is instead of trying to change it, seeing it as a problem, shouldn't be this way and trying to change it. Surrender, I think, is also a bridge. Once the vibration is high enough, even surrender is transcended into just this being and everything happening automatically, spontaneously, perfectly. But until then, the decision to surrender to something other than the ego. So I suppose we could say as long as the ego still thrives, there needs to be surrender into the more helpful ways of being. Otherwise, you just stay in the ego. And, I mentioned that the ego, it can be arrogant. I'm right. I know more than you. I'm better than you. Of course, there's no arrogance. What's interesting is there's this humility. But this humility has a quality of rightness or confidence in it. It's not, I am right. It's just knowing this is the right place to be, if that makes any sense. So it's a humility with a sense of rightness, confidence, knowing in it. But it's not arrogance. It's different than arrogance. But like, if someone was to come up and tell me that accepting this chest of drawers, or being happy with this chest of drawers right now was a mistake, that I should get rid of that chest of drawers right now, see, I would laugh, because there's a confidence in knowing that if I was to get rid of the chest of drawers right now, I would know that. Right. And if right now it feels just to be content with it as it is, then that's what I'm to do. So it's not an I am right and you are wrong arrogance like you feel in the ego. It's different. It's a humble knowing, a humble confidence. It's knowing that these ways of being are the right way of being in a non-arrogant way. And any movement that I am to do, I will know when it's time for the movement. Again, hard to say with words, but it has a completely different feeling to it than arrogance. I think I'm about out of time. I just looked at the clock. I think I only have 3 minutes left. So let me see if I can say these last few things a little faster. Allowing others to be as they are. Not asking other people to be different. Being in acceptance of whatever is, allowing whatever is. Being okay with not knowing now, not having to figure something out, knowing when I am to know, I will know. Being okay with not knowing now. Feeling free without needing freedom to look a certain way. A sense of beauty or a sense of life, they're really the same thing. A sense of abundance, even if I have nothing. Love of the stillness, even if it's not quiet right now. Just not that I need stillness. There's a stillness here that I love. These are aspects of clarity. So I think that's it. I think that's the list. And so I think I'll just stop now and I'll just say, I hope it's helpful. And I will see you live when I see you live. Probably not next week, because next week my family will be away for the weekend and I'll be with them. And again, I can't guarantee that I will be back to the place where we're staying by 5 o'clock my time, Mountain Time, which is when I'm to be here. Don't know yet whether I'm going to record another one or whether I'm just going to let Simon know I won't be there. So it'll probably be the week after that when I'm back live. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Bye.